On a bright October morning in 1987, 32-year-old postal carrier David Brennan left the Crestwood post office in rural Oregon to begin his daily route through the forested mountain roads he'd walked for 6 years. He never returned. His mail truck was found abandoned 3 miles outside town, driver's door open, mail scattered across the gravel shoulder. 32 years would pass before forensic genealogy would trace DNA evidence from David's jacket to a distant cousin of someone who had been closest to his family during those terrible first weeks. Someone who had organized search parties. Someone who had promised David's wife they would never stop looking. The person who finally led police to David's body had spent 3 decades sleeping 20 feet away from where they'd buried him. And the reason they did it would shake the foundations of a small town that thought it knew everyone's secrets. If you want to hear more cold cases like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We release new investigations every week, and your support helps us continue telling these important stories. The morning of October 23, 1987, started like any other Friday in Crestwood, Oregon. Population 8,400, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Range, where logging trucks shared the roads with deer and black bears. The kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where high school football games drew half the town, where everyone knew the postal carrier by name. David Brennan had been delivering mail in Crestwood since 1981. At 6'1" with sandy hair that curled at his collar and an easy smile that reached his blue eyes, he was exactly the kind of person neighbors looked forward to seeing. Not because he was particularly chatty, but because he paid attention. He remembered birthdays. He knew which elderly residents needed their packages brought to the door instead of left on the porch. He carried dog treats in his pocket for the retrievers and beagles who bounded out to greet him on his route. His wife, Margaret, was 7 months pregnant with their second child. Their daughter Emma, 4 years old with her father's curls and her mother's determination, had started preschool that September. They'd bought a small house on Maple Street 3 years earlier, a 2-bedroom with peeling yellow paint that David had been slowly renovating on weekends. His real passion, though, was the work he did in the garage every evening after dinner. David restored antique furniture, not as a business, just for the love of it. He haunted estate sales and barn auctions, coming home with broken chairs and water-damaged dressers that Margaret would eye skeptically. Another project? She'd tease, and he'd grin, already mentally cataloging the work ahead. He had a gift for seeing what something could become. A 1920s vanity with a cracked mirror became a pristine piece with fresh veneer and replaced glass. A set of dining chairs with broken spindles were reborn, with careful steam bending and wood turning. He gave most of his finished pieces away, to friends getting married or young families just starting out. The work itself was the reward. That Friday morning, David woke at 5:30 a.m. to Emma climbing into bed between him and Margaret. "Pancakes, Daddy?" she whispered, her breath warm against his cheek. He carried her downstairs, her small arms wrapped around his neck, and mixed batter while she stood on a chair beside him, helping him crack eggs. Margaret came down at 6:15, moving slowly, one hand on her rounded belly. David poured her coffee, added the cream she liked, kissed her forehead. These small rituals of their life together. "I'll be home by 4, he said, pulling on his postal service jacket. "Thought I'd work on that dresser for the Millers tonight. They're picking it up Sunday." "The one with the carved flowers?" Margaret asked. "That's the one. Just needs final sanding and a coat of oil." Emma hugged his legs. "Bring me a surprise, Daddy." "What kind of surprise?" "A good one." He laughed, scooped her up, kissed her cheek. "Deal." He set her down, grabbed his lunchbox, waved from the doorway. The last image his family would have of him, backlit by autumn morning sun, smiling. At 7 a.m., David clocked in at the Crestwood post office on Main Street. The building was a squat brick structure that had been there since 1952, with creaking wooden floors and the perpetual smell of paper and rubber stamps. His supervisor, Gene Harrison, was already sorting mail into route trays. "Morning, Dave. Got a light load today. Should be an easy Friday for you." "Sounds good to me. Margaret's got a doctor's appointment at 4. Don't want to be late." David loaded his truck, a white Grumman LLV with 140,000 miles on it, and a tape player that only worked if you hit it just right. He had a mixtape in there, Bruce Springsteen and Tom Petty and John Mellencamp, music for long stretches of empty road. He left the post office at 7:45 a.m., his usual time. His route covered the rural area northwest of Crestwood, a 40-mile circuit that took him up into the hills where houses sat on 5-acre lots carved out of Douglas fir forest. Some mailboxes were a quarter-mile from the road down gravel driveways. Others clustered at intersections where 3 or 4 properties met. He knew every house, every family, every dog. His first stops were in town, neighborhoods with sidewalks and children's bikes in yards. By 9:30 a.m., he'd be in the hill country, and by noon, he'd reach the furthest point of his route, a cluster of 5 houses near a place locals called Echo Point, where a granite cliff face caught sounds and threw them back. At 9:15 a.m., David was seen at the Morrison place on Ridge Road, delivering a package. Carol Morrison, a retired teacher who lived alone with 3 cats, chatted with him for a few minutes about her grandson's college acceptance letter. David congratulated her, said he'd bring a card to sign next time through. Carol watched him drive away, his truck disappearing around a curve into the trees. That was the last confirmed sighting of David Brennan alive. At 10:45 a.m., a logging truck driver named Paul Hitchens was heading south on Ridge Road when he saw the white postal truck pulled onto the shoulder about 3 miles past the Morrison house. The driver's door was open. Mail was scattered on the ground, envelopes fluttering in the October wind. No sign of the carrier. Paul slowed, then stopped. He got out of his cab, called out, "Hello? You all right?" Silence. Just wind in the pines and the distant sound of a creek. The scattered mail bothered him. Postal carriers didn't leave mail lying around. He walked closer, saw more envelopes spread along the gravel, some in the ditch, like they'd been thrown or dropped in a hurry. Paul walked to the truck's cab, keys in the ignition, radio still on, crackling with static. David's lunchbox on the passenger seat, unopened. His thermos of coffee wedged in the cup holder, still warm to the touch. Paul's stomach went cold. He'd lived in these mountains his whole life. He knew what could happen to people who got hurt or lost up here. He also knew something about this scene didn't add up. If David had needed to relieve himself or check a mailbox down a driveway, he wouldn't have left his door open. He wouldn't have dropped mail everywhere. Paul drove to the nearest house with a phone and called the sheriff's office. By noon, Deputy Sheriff Tom Garrett arrived at the scene with 2 other deputies. They found the mail truck exactly as Paul had described. They also found David's postal bag lying 15 feet from the truck, in the trees. Not dropped. Placed. Like someone had set it down carefully. Tom Garrett was a 20-year veteran of the sheriff's office, a man who'd seen his share of accidents and tragedies in these rural mountains. People got hurt logging. Cars went off narrow roads in winter. Hunters got lost. But this didn't feel like an accident. They searched the surrounding forest, called David's name until their voices went hoarse, found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, no footprints except Paul's and their own. Just that mail truck with its door open and mail scattered like confetti. By 2 p.m., word had spread through Crestwood. The postal carrier was missing. David Brennan, the man who knew everyone, who remembered birthdays, who restored broken things and made them beautiful again. Margaret Brennan got the call at 2:30 p.m. She was getting ready for her doctor's appointment, Emma coloring at the kitchen table. When the sheriff himself called instead of David, she knew. Something was terribly wrong. "Mrs. Brennan, this is Sheriff William Morse. I need you to stay calm. David's truck has been found abandoned on Ridge Road. We're searching for him now." The words didn't make sense at first. Abandoned. Searching. David was supposed to be delivering mail, then coming home to work on a dresser, then tucking Emma into bed while reading her favorite story about a brave rabbit. "What do you mean abandoned? Where is he?" "We don't know yet. We've got deputies and search teams mobilizing. I need to ask you some questions. Has David been worried about anything? Any troubles at work? Anyone who might want to harm him?" Harm him. The word landed like a punch. No. David doesn't have enemies. Everyone loves David. But even as she said it, Margaret felt the foundation of her world beginning to crack. By evening, half of Crestwood had volunteered to search. Loggers who knew the hills, hunters who knew the game trails, teachers and store clerks and mechanics, spreading out in lines, calling David's name into the gathering dark. One of the first to arrive at the search staging area was a man named Richard Carver. He was 43 years old, a carpenter who'd lived in Crestwood for 15 years. He'd been in the same bowling league as David, though they weren't particularly close friends, just acquaintances who nodded at each other in town, who might share a beer after league night. Richard approached Sheriff Morse with a map of the area, offering his knowledge of the backwoods. "I've hunted these hills for years. I know some old logging roads that aren't on official maps, places someone might. If David wandered off injured, he could have ended up anywhere." The sheriff, grateful for any help, assigned Richard to coordinate the search grid. Richard threw himself into the work with an intensity that people later remembered. He was there every day for 3 weeks, organizing volunteers, mapping searched areas with meticulous care, comforting Margaret when she came to the command center desperate for news. "We'll find him," Richard promised her, his hand on her shoulder. "I give you my word, Margaret. We won't stop until we find him." The search went on for 21 days. It became the largest volunteer effort in Crestwood's history. More than 300 people cycled through the search teams. Loggers brought their knowledge of hidden ravines and forgotten logging roads. Hunters provided trail maps marked with game paths and water sources. Teachers organized food and supplies at the staging area. The high school football team, boys who'd known David as the friendly mailman who always asked about their games, spent their weekends combing through underbrush with long poles. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense forest carpeted with fallen needles that could hide anything. Creek beds carved deep into stone where a body might wash downstream and lodge behind rocks. Old mine shafts from the logging era, unmarked and dangerous, their openings obscured by decades of growth. Black bears and mountain lions in the high country. A person could lie injured 50 feet from a trail and never be found. Sheriff Morse coordinated with state police and brought in search and rescue teams from Portland. They used helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras, flying grid patterns over the search area. They brought in tracking dogs who followed David's scent from his mail truck into the woods, but the scent trail ended abruptly about 100 yards from the truck, as if David had simply vanished into thin air. Or more likely, as investigators would later theorize, as if he'd been transported away in a vehicle. They dragged ponds. They checked abandoned buildings. They questioned drifters and transients who'd been seen in the area. They investigated every registered sex offender within 50 miles. They looked at recent parolees. They examined David's life with microscopic attention, searching for anything that might explain his disappearance. The mail truck yielded few clues, but what they found troubled investigators. Fingerprints belonged to David and to other postal workers who'd used the vehicle. No unknown prints. The scattered mail was examined piece by piece, every envelope photographed and logged. Nothing unusual in the contents. Nothing threatening or suspicious. The mail bag in the trees, though, that bothered everyone who saw it. Crime scene technician Angela Torres processed that bag 3 times. She swabbed every inch of the canvas strap, the metal clasps, the weathered fabric. She found David's fingerprints, as expected, but she also found something else. Partial prints that were too smudged to identify with 1987 technology, and biological material that might be skin cells, though DNA analysis in its current form couldn't tell them much. Someone else handled this bag, Angela told Sheriff Morse, and they tried to wipe it clean, but they missed spots. Can you get an ID from what's there? Not with current methods. We can type blood, but this isn't blood. If technology improves in the future, maybe. For now, I'm preserving everything we collect. That decision to preserve the evidence, to store those swabs properly in a climate-controlled evidence locker, would prove crucial 32 years later. Investigators interviewed everyone on David's route. The Morrisons had been the last confirmed sighting at 9:15 a.m. Carol Morrison remembered every detail of their brief conversation. David had been in good spirits. He'd mentioned the dresser he was working on, said he'd promised Emma a surprise when he got home. He'd driven away normally, waving as he turned the corner. Between the Morrison place and where the mail truck was found, there were 7 houses. 3 were occupied that day. The residents saw and heard nothing unusual. 2 families had been at work. 1 elderly couple had been inside watching television. A 7th house sat empty, the owners vacationing in California. Investigators searched it thoroughly. Nothing. No one after the Morrisons reported seeing the mail truck or David. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist in that 90-minute window between 9:15 and 10:45 a.m. A man, a truck, and 165 pounds of human being had disappeared from a rural road in broad daylight. One detail troubled investigators more as the days passed: the positioning of that mail bag in the trees. It hadn't been dropped or thrown. Crime scene photos showed it sitting upright, almost carefully placed, about 15 feet from the road. Why would someone do that? To create the illusion that David had walked away from his truck? To move something away from the immediate scene? Sheriff Morse worked the case 16 hours a day. He brought in state police investigators who specialized in missing persons. They conducted a psychological workup of David, looking for any reason he might have staged his own disappearance. They examined his bank records going back 5 years, interviewed his friends, his family, his co-workers at the post office. They found nothing that suggested David wanted to leave his life. His marriage was solid, by all accounts. Margaret and David rarely argued. Friends described them as devoted to each other. His finances were tight, as they were for most young families, but manageable. He had $8,400 in savings, money they'd been putting aside for a down payment on a better house. He had no secret debts, no gambling problem, no drug use, no extramarital affairs. His criminal record was spotless: 1 speeding ticket in 1983. That was it. His co-workers at the post office described him as reliable, punctual, well-liked. His supervisor, Gene Harrison, was adamant. Dave would never abandon his family. Never. Something happened to him out there. The psychological profile concluded David Brennan had no motive to disappear and no indication of suicidal ideation. He was a stable, well-adjusted man looking forward to the birth of his second child and planning for his family's future, which meant someone had taken him. The question was who and why. Tips came in steadily for the first 6 months. The sheriff's office received more than 200 calls. A man matching David's description seen at a truck stop in Washington state, pumping gas with a dazed expression. State police investigated. The man was a long-haul trucker from Montana who bore a superficial resemblance to David but was 4 inches shorter and had brown eyes instead of blue. Someone who looked like him buying gas at a station near the California border. Wrong person entirely. Different build, different age. A body found in the Cascade Mountains 30 miles away, discovered by hikers in a ravine. Different victim, different case. A young man who died in a climbing accident, unrelated to David. Psychics called offering visions. David was alive, being held captive. David was dead in a specific location described in vague terms. David had amnesia and was wandering the Pacific Northwest. Sheriff Morse followed up on every lead that had even a shred of credibility, but none led anywhere. The hardest calls were the cruel ones. People claiming to have seen David living under a new identity, married to another woman, happy and unburdened. One caller said David had planned his disappearance to escape his family responsibilities. These calls devastated Margaret, who was 8.5 months pregnant and barely holding herself together. The stress affected her pregnancy. Her doctor warned about preeclampsia. Her blood pressure climbed dangerously high. Friends came by to help with Emma, to bring meals, to sit with Margaret when the loneliness became unbearable. The same friends who'd searched for David now formed a support network around his family. Weeks became months. Margaret gave birth to their son, Michael, on December 18, 1987. David had wanted to name a boy Michael if they had one. Michael Francis Brennan, after David's grandfather. The labor was difficult. Margaret hemorrhaged and nearly died. When she held Michael for the first time, in a hospital room filled with flowers but missing the one person who should have been there, she wept. David never met his boy, never saw those tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, or heard that first cry, never changed a diaper, or walked the floor at 3 a.m. with a colicky infant, never took Michael to his first day of school or taught him to throw a baseball. Emma, now almost 5, struggled to understand why Daddy hadn't come home. Children that age don't grasp abstract concepts like death or missing. To Emma, Daddy was simply gone, and no one could tell her when he'd return. She asked every night at bedtime, "Is Daddy coming tomorrow?" And Margaret had no answer that made sense to a child. Margaret's parents moved to Crestwood to help. Her mother, Martha, a retired nurse, essentially ran the household for the first year, fed Emma, cared for the baby, kept Margaret functional when grief threatened to pull her under. Her father, Robert, took over the bills and household repairs, the things David had handled. Friends from church organized a meal train that lasted 6 months. Someone brought dinner every night. The gesture was kindness, but it also served as a constant reminder. David should be here. David should be sitting at this table, cutting Emma's chicken into small bites, making silly faces to make her laugh. The post office gave Margaret David's final paycheck and the death benefits from his federal employee life insurance, though without a body or a death certificate, the insurance company initially refused to pay. It took a lawyer and 6 months of negotiations. Eventually, they settled for half the policy value, $50,000 instead of $100,000. It was supposed to be enough to help Margaret and the children start over. Instead, it felt like blood money, compensation for a man who might still be alive somewhere. The case went cold, not from lack of effort, but from lack of evidence. By March 1988, investigators had interviewed 247 people. They'd searched 340 square miles of forest. They'd followed up on 216 tips. They'd examined David's life from every angle, and they had nothing concrete. No body, no witnesses to an abduction, no forensic evidence that led anywhere useful. It's extraordinarily difficult to solve a crime when you don't even know for certain that a crime occurred. The most likely scenarios all pointed to foul play. The mailbag in the trees, the scattered letters, the open truck door. But without a body, without witnesses, without physical evidence connecting a suspect to the scene, they had no case to prosecute, even if they'd had a suspect. David could theoretically have had a medical emergency, an aneurysm, a seizure, stumbled into the woods disoriented, and died of exposure in some hidden ravine the searchers missed. It happened in these mountains. People got lost and died 50 feet from trails, hidden by undergrowth or fallen timber. But Sheriff Morse didn't believe it. That mailbag haunted him. He'd wake at 3 a.m. thinking about it, the way it had been positioned so carefully in the trees. Someone had carried it there deliberately. Someone had staged that scene. Sheriff Morse kept working the case for 3 more years, until he retired in 1990. He passed the file to his successor, Sheriff Daniel Cross, with explicit instructions. Don't let this die. Someone in this county knows what happened. Someone saw something, heard something. Keep asking questions. Sheriff Cross did his best. He reopened the investigation every year on the anniversary of David's disappearance, ran new articles in the local paper, put up new flyers, conducted follow-up interviews with people on David's route. But as years passed, memories faded. Witnesses moved away. The trail grew colder. The town didn't forget David, though. The post office put up a memorial plaque in the lobby, bronze with his photo and dates. October 23rd became an unofficial day of remembrance. Local churches held prayer services. The VFW post, though David had never served in the military, included his name in their Memorial Day ceremonies, recognizing him as someone who'd served his community faithfully. Emma grew up without her father. She was 8 when she stopped asking when Daddy would come home. 11 when she finally accepted he was probably dead. 14 when the anger hit, the furious unfairness that every other kid had a dad and she didn't. 17 when she gave the valedictory speech at her high school graduation and mentioned that her father would have been proud, and half the audience wept. Michael never knew his father except through stories and photographs. There was no memory of David's voice or laugh or the way he'd smelled like Old Spice and wood shavings. Just images frozen in time, a young man with curly hair and a warm smile, holding a tiny Emma, standing beside a restored dresser, proud of his work. These static moments that could never capture who David had really been. Margaret never remarried. Friends tried to set her up on dates over the years, well-meaning attempts to help her move forward. She went on 3 dates in 15 years, all disasters. She couldn't imagine building a life with someone new when she'd never gotten closure on the life she'd lost. Grief without resolution is a special kind of torture. No funeral to attend, no grave to visit. Just this suspended uncertainty that stretched across decades. She kept David's workshop in the garage exactly as he'd left it. His tools hung on pegboards, arranged by size and type the way he'd liked them. His half-finished projects gathered dust. That dresser for the Millers, the one he'd been planning to sand and oil the night he disappeared. It sat there for 32 years, unfinished, a silent testimony to interrupted plans. Sometimes Margaret would go out there late at night when she couldn't sleep. She'd run her fingers over wood he'd touched, sit on his work stool, breathe in the lingering scent of sawdust and varnish. She'd remember the sound of his laugh, the feel of his hands, rough from work, but always gentle with her and Emma. These midnight vigils were the closest she could come to having him back. The people of Crestwood carried David with them in small ways. Every October 23rd, someone left flowers at the spot where his mail truck had been found. First it was Margaret, until her knees got too bad to make the trek into the hills. Then Emma took over the ritual. Sometimes other townspeople joined. A small, informal gathering, never advertised, just people who remembered. The case file sat in the sheriff's office. 3 cardboard boxes of evidence and interview transcripts and maps marked with searched areas. Every few years, a new deputy would pull the file, read through it, try to find something previous investigators had missed. The case had an unofficial status, the one that got away, the mystery that haunted the department. Richard Carver, the carpenter who'd worked so hard during those initial search efforts, was remembered as one of the heroes of that terrible time. People spoke fondly of how he'd dedicated himself to finding David, how he'd organized search grids with such methodical care, how he'd been there for Margaret in her darkest hours, promising they'd never stop looking. In 1993, Richard moved to a different house. Nothing suspicious about it at the time. His previous place had been a rental on the east side of town, a small 2-bedroom that his landlord decided to sell. Richard bought a property on the west edge of Crestwood, 2 acres with a modest house, room for a larger workshop, a place to settle down permanently. He spent that summer building his new workshop, a substantial structure, 20 by 30 feet, with concrete foundation and floor. He did most of the work himself, was particular about every detail. Neighbors saw him out there late into the evenings, working by floodlight. "Man's dedicated to his craft," they said. No one thought anything of it. Richard married in 1995. Linda Mackenzie, a quiet woman who worked at the county library, had moved to Crestwood in 1994 from Portland after her divorce. She and Richard met at the hardware store, of all places, both reaching for the same package of wood screws. They started talking, discovered they both enjoyed quiet evenings, and had no interest in the social whirl of small-town life. They married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, just 2 witnesses from the library. Linda was happy to find someone steady and reliable after her tumultuous first marriage. Richard seemed perfect. Calm, capable, financially stable. He had his carpentry business. She had her library job. They had their quiet life. Linda never went into Richard's workshop uninvited. It was his space, his sanctuary. She respected that. Sometimes she'd hear him out there late at night, the sound of sanding or sawing drifting across the yard, working on custom cabinets or furniture pieces for clients, building things, creating things. She found it comforting, that sound of productive work. They kept to themselves mostly. Richard still did carpentry, built custom cabinets and furniture for people throughout the county. His reputation was solid. Fair prices, quality work, reliable. People recommended him. "Richard Carver's your man if you need custom woodwork," they'd say. He attended the memorial services for David every few years, standing quietly in the back, respectful. People appreciated that he still cared, still remembered. No one suspected. Why would they? Richard Carver was a respected tradesman, a devoted husband, a quiet member of the community. The idea that he might be connected to David's disappearance never crossed anyone's mind. In January 2019, the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit underwent restructuring. Budget increases from the state legislature allowed them to hire specialists in emerging forensic techniques. One of those specialists was Dr. Sarah Chen, a molecular biologist who'd spent 5 years working with genetic genealogy companies before moving into law enforcement consultation. Dr. Chen had helped crack the Golden State Killer case in California, building the family tree that led investigators to Joseph DeAngelo. She understood the power of genetic genealogy and the ethical complexities it raised. She was meticulous, careful, and driven by a conviction that old cases deserved the benefit of new science. In March 2019, Dr. Chen was systematically reviewing Oregon cold cases from 1970 through 1995. She was looking for specific criteria, cases where biological evidence existed but had never been analyzed with modern DNA techniques, cases where conventional investigation had exhausted all leads, cases where families were still seeking answers. The David Brennan case caught her attention immediately. A postal carrier who vanished in broad daylight from a rural road in 1987. Never found. But there was evidence. Those swabs from the mailbag, carefully preserved by crime scene technician Angela Torres, 32 years earlier. Stored properly. Chain of custody maintained. Still viable for modern analysis. Dr. Chen requested the evidence from the Crestwood Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Maria Rodriguez, who'd taken over in 2016, was enthusiastic about reopening the case. She'd grown up in Crestwood, remembered the search for David Brennan when she was 7 years old. Her father had been part of the volunteer search teams. If there's any chance of solving this, Sheriff Rodriguez told Dr. Chen, we need to try. Margaret Brennan deserves answers. Emma and Michael deserve to know what happened to their father. The evidence arrived at the State Crime Lab in Salem in April 2019. Dr. Chen and her team extracted DNA from the swabs Angela Torres had collected in 1987. The process was delicate. Old biological samples degrade over time. Proteins break down. Cells deteriorate. But modern extraction techniques could work miracles with even minimal material. They got a profile. Male DNA, not David's. Someone else had handled that mailbag. Someone who'd left skin cells behind when they gripped the canvas strap or touched the metal clasps. The profile was incomplete. They had enough markers for identification, but not the full spectrum they'd get from fresh samples. Still, it was usable. Dr. Chen ran it through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system that contains profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees. No match. The person who touched that bag wasn't in the criminal database. This is where traditional DNA investigation would have stopped in previous years. No match meant no lead, but genetic genealogy opened a new path. Dr. Chen uploaded the profile to GED Match, a public database where people who've used consumer DNA testing services like 23andMe or Ancestry.com can upload their raw data to find relatives. GED Match contained profiles from over 1 million users. People exploring family history. Adoptees searching for biological parents. Genealogy enthusiasts building family trees. Most had no idea their genetic information might be used to solve crimes. The ethical debates around this practice were ongoing, but in 2019, it was legal and increasingly common. Dr. Chen got a hit in late April. Not a direct match, but a distant relative. The genetic relationship was calculated at approximately 400 centimorgans of shared DNA, consistent with a fourth cousin relationship. This meant the person whose DNA was on David's mailbag and the person in the GED Match database shared common ancestors roughly 4 generations back. This is where the painstaking work began. Dr. Chen wasn't just a scientist. She was a genealogist. She began building a family tree, starting with the known fourth cousin and working backwards through generations. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, census documents. She traced the fourth cousin's ancestry back to identify common ancestors. The shared ancestors were Elijah and Martha Carver, who had homesteaded in eastern Oregon in 1893. They'd had 8 children who survived to adulthood. Those 8 children had produced dozens of grandchildren, who in turn had produced hundreds of great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren scattered across Oregon, Washington, California, and Idaho. Dr. Chen had to trace every line of descent from Elijah and Martha forward through time. Every child, grandchild, great-grandchild, every marriage that brought new surnames into the family, every move to a new state. It was genealogical detective work on a massive scale. She spent 6 weeks on this work, often late into the night, building the tree branch by branch. She used Ancestry.com, Family Search, state vital records databases. She found obituaries in old newspapers. She tracked down living relatives and, without revealing why, asked about family history. By early June, she had narrowed the possibilities. The DNA had to come from someone in one of 3 family lines descended from Elijah and Martha. One line had moved to Idaho in the 1950s. One had settled in California. The third had stayed in Oregon, with branches spreading through Portland, Eugene, and smaller towns throughout the state. Dr. Chen cross-referenced her family tree with geographic and temporal data. Who from these family lines had lived in or near Crestwood in 1987? Who would have been old enough to commit a violent crime? Who had the opportunity? On July 8, 2019, she found a name that made her pause. Richard Allen Carver, born 1951 in Boise, Idaho, moved to Crestwood, Oregon in 1972, worked as a carpenter, still living in Crestwood as of current records. Richard was a great-great-grandson of Elijah and Martha Carver through their son William. The genetic relationship to the fourth cousin in GED match fit perfectly. He was the right age in 1987. He'd been in Crestwood when David disappeared. Dr. Chen dug deeper into Richard's background. She found the divorce record from 1970, the restraining order his ex-wife had filed, the domestic violence allegations, unproven but documented. She found the case file from Idaho, the missing waitress in 1971, who'd never been found. Richard had been questioned, but never charged. On July 10th, Dr. Chen contacted Sheriff Rodriguez and shared her findings. They brought in state police investigators and the county prosecutor. They reviewed Dr. Chen's genealogical work, verified her methodology, confirmed the genetic relationship calculations. Then they looked at Richard's involvement in the David Brennan case. He'd been part of the search effort. He'd helped organize volunteer teams. He'd been visible and helpful throughout. This is common, Dr. Chen explained in the briefing. Killers inserting themselves into investigations. It gives them a sense of control, lets them monitor what police know. Some find satisfaction in seeing the grief they've caused. But they needed more than genealogical analysis and behavioral profiling. They needed Richard Carver's actual DNA to confirm he was the source of the material on David's mailbag. And they needed to find David's body to prove a crime had occurred. On July 18, 2019, 2 plainclothes detectives approached Richard Carver outside the Home Depot in Crestwood. He'd been loading lumber into his truck, whistling softly to himself. It was a warm summer afternoon. Richard was 68 years old now, his hair gray, his movements still steady despite his age. Detective James Walsh introduced himself and his partner, Detective Karen Mendez. They showed their badges, kept their tone casual and friendly. Mr. Carver, we're working on some old cold cases, trying to use new technology to close them. We're asking people who were involved in past investigations if they'd be willing to provide DNA samples to help us eliminate them as persons of interest. It was a careful dance. They couldn't force Richard to provide DNA without probable cause for arrest. They needed him to volunteer. The approach was designed to seem routine, non-threatening, just helping with an old case. Richard set down the lumber he'd been holding. Which case? The David Brennan disappearance from 1987. We know you helped with the search efforts back then. We're going through everyone who was involved, collecting elimination samples. Detective Mendez watched Richard's face carefully. She'd been trained in micro-expressions, those tiny, unconscious movements that reveal emotion. She saw something flicker across Richard's features, gone in an instant, but she'd seen it. A tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible clench of his jaw. That was a long time ago, Richard said. His voice was even, controlled. It was, but DNA technology has improved dramatically since then. We're able to analyze evidence that wasn't usable in 1987. We're hoping to finally give David's family some answers. Richard was silent for a long moment. The detectives waited, letting the silence stretch. This was a critical juncture. If Richard refused and asked for a lawyer, they'd have to pursue a warrant, which would tip him off that he was a prime suspect. Of course, Richard finally said. Happy to help. I think about David sometimes. Terrible thing that happened to him. Detective Walsh pulled out a DNA collection kit, a simple cheek swab. This'll just take a second. Richard opened his mouth, let Walsh swab the inside of his cheek. The whole process took less than 30 seconds. Richard signed the consent form. What case are you working on specifically? Richard asked. His tone was casual, but Detective Mendez heard something underneath. Anxiety? Curiosity? Just trying to identify some unknown DNA we found on evidence from the scene, Walsh said vaguely. Probably nothing, but we need to eliminate possibilities. Richard nodded. I hope it helps. David deserves justice. His family deserves to know what happened. The detectives thanked him and left. In their car, Mendez turned to Walsh. Did you see his reaction when you mentioned Brennan's name? I saw it. He's worried. Let's hope his DNA confirms why. The sample went to the state crime lab that afternoon, marked urgent priority. Dr. Chen processed it herself, working late into the evening. She extracted DNA, amplified the markers, compared them to the profile from David's mailbag. At 9:47 p.m. on July 25, 2019, she had the results. Perfect match. 13 matching markers. Probability of random match less than 1 in a trillion. Richard Carver's DNA was on David Brennan's mailbag. Dr. Chen immediately called Sheriff Rodriguez and Detective Walsh. They convened an emergency meeting with the county prosecutor, District Attorney Michael Barnes, at 10:30 p.m. in the sheriff's office conference room. We have him on DNA, Barnes said, studying Dr. Chen's report. But DNA on a mailbag doesn't prove murder. Carver was involved in the search. He could claim he touched the bag while helping process the scene. Crime scene logs show he never handled evidence directly, Sheriff Rodriguez countered. We were careful about chain of custody, even back then. He'll say he doesn't remember, that maybe he picked it up before deputies arrived. It's been 32 years. Detective Walsh leaned forward. Then we need to find the body. If David's remains are on Carver's property, there's no innocent explanation for that. You think the body's on his property? Barnes asked. Where else would it be? Walsh said. He's lived in Crestwood this whole time. He bought that property in 1993, 6 years after David disappeared. Spent months building that workshop, doing all the foundation and concrete work himself. He was particular about not letting anyone help. Dr. Chen pulled up property records on her laptop. 2 acres, mostly wooded. House built in 1988. Workshop added in 1993 by owner. Carver did the work himself, pulled the permits, everything by the book. We need a warrant, Barnes said, but we need probable cause stronger than DNA on a mailbag. Judge Hendricks won't sign off on excavating someone's property based on that alone. They spent 2 hours building the case. Richard's DNA on the mailbag, his presence during the investigation, his history in Idaho, the restraining order, the questioned but never charged status in another missing person case, his purchase of property and construction of a workshop shortly after David's disappearance, the behavioral profile of killers inserting themselves into investigations. At 1:15 a.m. on July 26th, Judge Patricia Hendricks reviewed the warrant application in her home office. She read it twice, asked pointed questions about the genetic genealogy methodology and the reliability of the DNA match. Finally, she signed. But Sheriff Rodriguez, Judge Hendricks said, if you don't find anything, this department will have destroyed an innocent man's property and reputation. Be absolutely certain. We're certain, Your Honor. The search warrant was executed on August 2, 2019, at 6 a.m. 8 investigators, 2 cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar equipment, and excavation machinery arrived at Richard's property while he and Linda were still asleep. Sheriff Rodriguez knocked on the door herself. Linda answered in her bathrobe, confused and frightened. Richard appeared behind her, his face unreadable. Richard Carver, we have a warrant to search your property in connection with the disappearance of David Brennan. Sheriff Rodriguez handed him the document. Richard read it slowly. His hands didn't shake. He showed no visible reaction except a slight tightening of his lips. There's nothing here, he said quietly. Then you have nothing to worry about, Sheriff Rodriguez replied. Richard and Linda were relocated to the Crestwood Inn, a small hotel in town. 2 deputies stayed with them, not under arrest, but not free to leave. The search would take days, possibly weeks. The investigation team started with the workshop. It was exactly as you'd expect a carpenter's workspace to be. Tools organized on pegboards, a workbench with a vise, sawdust on the concrete floor, projects in various stages of completion. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But the cadaver dogs were interested. Both dogs, Max and Sadie, trained German shepherds with years of experience, behaved the same way. They entered the workshop, sniffed around the perimeter, then sat down in the northwest corner and refused to move. This was their alert behavior. They detected the scent of human decomposition. The problem was that human decomposition creates chemical compounds that seep into soil and concrete, persisting for decades. The dogs couldn't tell investigators if the source was 6 inches down or 6 feet down. That's where ground-penetrating radar came in. The GPR technician, Marcus Liu, spent 3 hours scanning the workshop floor. The concrete was 6 inches thick, professionally poured. Beneath it, the GPR showed disturbed soil at varying depths. One area in particular showed a significant anomaly. The soil density was different from surrounding areas, and there was a large void space approximately 6 feet down. Something's buried there, Liu told Sheriff Rodriguez. Can't tell you what, but the soil's been excavated and refilled, and there's something in it that's creating this density variation. They brought in excavation equipment. Breaking through 6 inches of concrete with jackhammers was loud, brutal work. Linda could hear it from the hotel 2 miles away and sobbed in her room, still insisting there must be some mistake. By noon, they'd broken through the concrete in a 10 by 10 foot section. Then, they began carefully removing soil, layer by layer, photographing and documenting everything. At 2 feet deep, they found a layer of lime. Someone had poured agricultural lime over whatever was buried. Lime accelerates decomposition, but also helps control odor. It's a common method used by people trying to conceal bodies. At 4 feet, they found fragments of plastic sheeting. Black industrial-grade plastic, the kind used in construction for moisture barriers. It was deteriorated, but still recognizable. At 6 feet, they found the plastic wrap around something. The excavation slowed to painstaking care. Investigators used hand tools, brushes. Every inch was photographed and documented. Inside the plastic was a skeleton. Adult male based on pelvic structure and skull characteristics. Clothing remnants, badly deteriorated but identifiable. The distinctive blue-gray of a U.S. Postal Service uniform jacket. Scraps of a shirt underneath. Remnants of boots. In the pocket of the jacket, they found a watch, corroded, but with an inscription visible on the back. To David, love always, M. Margaret had given it to him on their 5th wedding anniversary. In another pocket, a wedding ring. Gold band, simple, with the inscription inside. D&M forever, 1981. David and Margaret. Their wedding year. They'd found him. After 32 years of searching, after hundreds of volunteers had combed mountains and forests, David Brennan had been buried 20 feet from where his killer had spent the last 26 years building furniture and living a quiet life. The forensic anthropology examination took 3 days. Dr. Patricia Gomez, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, conducted a thorough analysis. The skeleton was definitely male, age consistent with early 30s. Height calculated from long bone measurements, approximately 6 feet 1 inch. Dental work matched David Brennan's records perfectly. 3 fillings in specific teeth, a crown on an upper molar from a root canal he'd had in 1985. But it was the skull that told the story of how David died. Dr. Gomez found a depressed fracture at the base of the skull, just above where the spine connects. The fracture pattern was consistent with a single heavy blow from a blunt object, possibly cylindrical, something like a tire iron or a pipe. The blow had been delivered with significant force from behind and slightly above, suggesting the attacker was either taller than David, or David was bent forward at the time. This would have been immediately fatal or near fatal, Dr. Gomez explained in her report. Massive trauma to the brainstem. He would have lost consciousness instantly and died within minutes, if not seconds. He didn't suffer, if that's any consolation to the family. It was small consolation, but Margaret clung to it. David hadn't suffered, hadn't known what was happening. One moment he'd been alive, thinking about finishing a dresser and going home to his family. The next moment, nothing. On August 6, 2019, at 6:30 a.m., Richard Carver was arrested in his hotel room. He was sitting at the small table by the window, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, when Sheriff Rodriguez and 4 deputies entered. Linda was in the bathroom and emerged to see her husband being handcuffed. Richard Carver, you are under arrest for the murder of David Brennan. You have the right to remain silent. Linda screamed. Actually screamed, a sound of pure anguish and disbelief. No, there's been a mistake. Richard, tell them. Richard said nothing. His face was completely blank, as if he'd retreated somewhere deep inside himself. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just allowed himself to be led away. At the sheriff's office, Richard was placed in an interrogation room. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, a metal table bolted to the floor. He sat there for 2 hours before anyone spoke to him, a deliberate tactic to let anxiety build. But when Detectives Walsh and Mendez finally entered, Richard showed no signs of anxiety. He sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, expression neutral. They read him his rights again, formally, recorded on camera. Richard acknowledged he understood. They asked if he wanted a lawyer. Richard hesitated for a long moment, then said, "Not yet." Detective Walsh laid out the evidence methodically. Your DNA was found on David Brennan's mailbag, the bag that was carefully placed in the trees, away from his truck. Can you explain that? I must have touched it during the search. Crime scene logs show you never handled physical evidence. You organized search teams, but you weren't part of the evidence processing. Richard said nothing. Detective Mendez opened a folder containing photographs from the excavation, the plastic-wrapped remains, the wedding ring with its inscription, the watch Margaret had given David. We found David Brennan buried beneath your workshop floor, the workshop you built yourself in 1993. Can you explain that? Richard stared at the photographs. Something shifted in his face. Not quite emotion, but perhaps a recognition that denial was no longer possible. I'd like to consult with a lawyer before answering any more questions. The interrogation ended there. Richard's lawyer, a defense attorney named Thomas Fletcher from Portland, arrived that afternoon. Richard spent 3 days in county jail, held without bail on murder charges, consulting with Fletcher, presumably deciding what to do. On the 4th day, Fletcher requested a meeting with the district attorney. Michael Barnes, Detective Walsh, and Sheriff Rodriguez sat across from Fletcher and Richard in a conference room. My client is prepared to make a statement, Fletcher said carefully. He wants it on record that he's doing this voluntarily, without any promise of leniency or plea deal. Barnes leaned forward. We're listening. Richard spoke in a flat, almost mechanical voice, like he was recounting something that had happened to someone else. I saw something I shouldn't have seen. David saw something he shouldn't have seen. And I made a choice I've lived with every day since. What did David see? Walsh asked. Richard looked down at his hands. I was with someone, a girl. She was 17. It had been going on for about 4 months. She babysat for families in town. We'd meet on back roads when she'd skip school. That morning, October 23rd, she was in my truck. We'd been together. Richard stumbled over the words, unable or unwilling to be more explicit. But everyone in the room understood. Statutory rape. A 43-year-old man with a 17-year-old girl. David drove past in his mail truck. He stopped, asked if everything was okay. He recognized the girl, knew she was supposed to be in school. I could see him putting it together, understanding what was happening. What happened then? I told her to wait in my truck. I got out, walked over to David's truck, acted concerned, like I'd stopped to see if he needed help with his truck. He was polite about it, but I could tell. He knew. He was going to report it. Richard's voice remained flat, emotionless, the detailing of horror in monotone. I had a tire iron in my truck bed. I was going to use it for some work that day. I grabbed it while David wasn't looking. He'd turned his back, was checking something in his mail truck. I walked up behind him and I hit him. Once. Hard as I could. The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the quiet scratch of the court reporter's stenography machine. He dropped, didn't make a sound. I knew immediately he was dead or dying. The girl saw it happen. She was screaming. I told her to shut up, threatened her, told her if she told anyone, I'd say she'd helped me, that she'd go to prison too. What was her name? Barnes demanded. Richard shook his head. I won't tell you that. She was a victim. She'd been manipulated by me. She spent 32 years terrified and guilty. Whatever happens to me, she doesn't deserve more punishment. The detectives knew they'd identify her anyway through investigation. but they let it go for now. What did you do with David's body? I put him in the back of his mail truck, told the girl to follow me in my truck. I drove David's truck 3 miles up the road, scattered the mail around to make it look like he'd left on foot, wiped down what I could. Then I drove my truck back, with David's body in the bed, covered with a tarp. Where did you keep him? There was a root cellar on the property I was renting, stone walls, underground. I put him there, covered him with lime and plastic. I knew I'd have to move him eventually, but I needed time to figure out what to do. When did you move him? When I bought my new property in 1993. I planned it for months. How to do it without being seen. I moved him at night, one night in July when Linda was visiting her sister in Portland. Buried him where I was going to build my workshop. Then I built the workshop over him, poured concrete, made it permanent. Richard finally looked up, met Detective Walsh's eyes. I thought about him every day, every single day for 32 years. When I was in that workshop, I knew he was there, beneath my feet. When I built furniture, I thought about how David used to restore furniture. When I saw Margaret in town, I thought about what I'd taken from her. But you never confessed, Sheriff Rodriguez said, her voice hard. You let them search for him. You helped organize those searches, knowing he was hidden in your root cellar the whole time. I was a coward, Richard said simply. I am a coward. I've been a coward for 32 years. I let everyone suffer because I was too afraid to face what I'd done. Detective Mendez leaned forward. The girl. Where is she now? I don't know. She left Crestwood right after high school. I didn't keep track of her. I didn't want to know. I hoped she'd forgotten, moved on, had a life. But they would find her. Through Richard's old records, through high school yearbooks, through interviews with people who'd known him in 1987. They tracked down the girl who'd been 17 that October morning. Her name was Jennifer Ross, now Jennifer Matthews, 50 years old, living in Seattle with a husband and 3 teenage children. When Detectives Walsh and Mendez knocked on her door in late August 2019, she knew immediately why they were there. She didn't even ask them in, just stood in her doorway and began to cry. I wanted to tell, she sobbed. God, I've wanted to tell every day since it happened. But he said he'd kill me, said he'd kill my family. I believed him. I was 17 and terrified, and I believed him. They brought her in for an interview, treated her gently. She'd been a victim too, groomed and manipulated by a man more than twice her age, then forced to be complicit in covering up a murder. The statute of limitations on statutory rape had long since passed. She wouldn't face criminal charges, but she'd face her own reckoning. Jennifer's testimony, given voluntarily despite her lawyer's advice to remain silent, was devastating. She described the relationship Richard had cultivated with her, starting when she was 16. How he'd made her feel special, mature. How isolated she'd been, an only child with working parents, looking for attention anywhere she could find it. She described that October morning, the horror of watching Richard strike David Brennan, the blood, the terrible finality of it, how Richard had grabbed her, shaken her, told her they were in this together now, how he'd threatened her family, described in gruesome detail what he'd do to her mother and father if she ever told. I couldn't even look at mail carriers after that, Jennifer said, her voice breaking. Every time I saw someone in that uniform, I'd think of Mr. Brennan, of his blood on the ground, of how his hand twitched once after Richard hit him, then stopped. For years, I had nightmares. I still have nightmares. She'd left Crestwood 2 days after graduating high school in 1988, moved to Seattle, changed her last name when she married, tried to build a life far away from the horror. She'd never babysat again, never went back to Crestwood. When her parents died in the early 2000s, she'd had them cremated and buried in Seattle rather than return to Oregon for a funeral. "I thought I'd gotten away from it," she said. "I thought if I never went back, never thought about it, I could pretend it hadn't happened." But you don't escape something like that. It's always there, underneath everything. Every happy moment with my kids, there's this voice reminding me that another man's kids grew up without their father because I was too scared to tell the truth. Richard Carver went to trial in May 2020. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The forensic evidence was damning. DNA on the mailbag, the body on his property, the testimony of the woman who'd been 17 when it happened, now willing to face her past. Richard's defense tried to argue the evidence was circumstantial, that someone else could have planted the body on his property years earlier. But the prosecution dismantled that theory methodically. The timeline, the motive, the pattern of manipulation and violence in Richard's history. Margaret Brennan attended every day of the trial. She was 67 years old now, her children grown. Emma was 36 with children of her own. Michael, who'd never met his father, was 32, the same age David had been when he died. On the witness stand, Margaret spoke about the man Richard had taken from her. "David was gentle," she said, her voice steady. "He fixed broken things. He made beautiful furniture with his hands. He remembered people's birthdays. He was going to be there when our son was born." Her voice cracked then. "Richard Carver stole 32 years from our family. He stole David's chance to meet his son. He stole my children's father. And he slept every night 20 feet from where he'd buried him." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Richard Carver guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the judge gave him life in prison without possibility of parole. Richard, now 70 years old, showed no emotion, but his wife Linda, who'd known nothing of any of it, wept in the gallery. "Mr. Carver," the judge said, "you took a man's life to hide your own crimes. You robbed a family of their husband and father. You spent 32 years living your life while David Brennan lay in the ground. You participated in searches for him, comforted his widow, all while knowing exactly where he was. That level of deception, that level of cruelty, warrants the maximum sentence this court can impose." The day after sentencing, Margaret and her children went to the property where David had been found. The workshop had been demolished. The earth had been restored. They planted a Douglas fir tree there, the kind that grew throughout these Oregon hills, the kind David would have driven past every day on his mail route. Emma's daughter, 8 years old, helped pat soil around the roots. "This is for great-grandpa David," Emma explained. "So something living grows here." Margaret stood with her hand on the small tree, feeling the breeze that came down from the mountains. She thought about David's workshop at home, still preserved, still holding his tools and his unfinished projects. She'd kept it for 32 years as a shrine, a place to feel close to him. Maybe now she could let it go. Maybe now the grandchildren could learn woodworking in that space, using David's tools to create new things, carrying on what he'd started. Michael spoke quietly. "I wish I'd known him." "He would have loved you," Margaret said. "He would have taught you to restore furniture, to see the beauty in broken things." They stood together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The same sun that had risen on that October morning in 1987, when David Brennan had kissed his wife and daughter goodbye, promising to bring home a surprise. In a way, he'd kept that promise. The truth had come home. After 32 years, after advances in science that didn't exist when he died, after a genealogist building family trees across centuries, justice had arrived. It wouldn't bring David back. It wouldn't give Michael the father he'd never known, or return the years Emma had spent wondering, but it meant something. It meant David's death hadn't gone unnoticed. It meant the man who'd taken him had finally been held accountable. And it meant that in a small town in Oregon, where people still remembered the postal carrier who knew everyone's name, David Brennan could finally rest. The David Brennan case illustrates several crucial elements of cold case investigation in the modern era. First, the preservation of evidence. Those swabs taken in 1987 seemed useless at the time, but they became the key to justice 32 years later. Every piece of evidence collected at a crime scene is potentially valuable, even if current technology can't analyze it. Second, the power of genetic genealogy. By 2019, this technique had revolutionized cold case work. The distant cousin who uploaded their DNA to GEDmatch had no idea they'd help solve a murder. They were simply exploring family history. But that choice created a genealogical breadcrumb trail that led investigators to Richard Carver. Third, the importance of behavioral analysis. Even in 1987, Sheriff Morse had felt something was wrong about the scene. The placed mailbag, the scattered envelopes. His instincts were correct, but instincts aren't enough without evidence. Modern science finally caught up with what he'd suspected all along. Richard Carver's involvement in the search for David was a classic example of a killer inserting himself into the investigation. He wanted to monitor what police knew. He wanted to ensure no evidence pointed to him. And perhaps there was something darker, a need to be close to the aftermath of what he'd done, to see the grief he'd caused. The woman who'd been 17 when David was killed carried the burden of that secret for more than 3 decades. Her testimony at trial was devastating, both for what it revealed about the crime and for what it showed about the lasting impact of trauma. At 17, she'd been groomed and manipulated by a man twice her age, then forced to be complicit in covering up a murder. The guilt had shaped her entire adult life. For Margaret Brennan and her children, the resolution brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that they finally knew what happened. Grief, reopened and raw, that David's death had been so senseless, so brutal. Anger at the years stolen from them, but also gratitude for the investigators who'd never given up, for the scientist who'd seen potential in old evidence, for the technology that made justice possible. Today, David's restored furniture is scattered throughout Crestwood. A vanity in one home, dining chairs in another, a dresser passed down through a family. Each piece a reminder that broken things can be made beautiful again, that careful work and patient hands can restore what seemed lost. The post office in Crestwood has a different memorial now, not just a plaque, but a bench that David's son Michael built and donated, made from reclaimed wood, with a small brass plate that reads, "In memory of David Brennan, who always delivered." Richard Carver is serving his sentence at Oregon State Penitentiary. He's 70 years old now, in declining health, unlikely to outlive his sentence. In prison interviews, he's claimed remorse, though some question its sincerity. He says he thinks about David every day, about the choice he made in a moment of panic that destroyed multiple lives. In the end, the David Brennan case reminds us that justice delayed is not justice denied. Technology advances. Witnesses find courage to speak. Scientists discover new ways to read evidence that seemed mute. And families, even after decades of grief and uncertainty, can finally lay their loved ones to rest with the truth. David Brennan was 32 years old when he died. He left behind a wife, 2 children, a community that loved him, and a workshop full of unfinished projects. It took 32 years to bring his killer to justice, but those years didn't diminish the determination of those who sought the truth. His mail route is now covered by a different carrier, someone who never knew David, but who's heard the stories. How he remembered birthdays, how he carried dog treats, how he saw beauty in broken things and believed they could be restored. Every October 23rd, someone still leaves flowers at the spot where his truck was found. Not Margaret anymore. She's too frail to make the journey. But Emma goes. Sometimes Michael. Sometimes townspeople who remember. The Douglas fir tree they planted where David was found is growing strong now. In a few years, it will tower over the property, its branches reaching toward the Oregon sky. A living memorial to a man who deserved to watch his children grow, to meet his grandchildren, to finish his projects and start new ones. David Brennan's story is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the power of persistence, to the advancement of science, and to the truth that even after decades of silence, justice can still find its voice. For anyone who knew David, for anyone who delivers mail on rural routes, for anyone who restores broken things with patient hands, his memory endures, not as a victim, but as a person who mattered, who was loved, who was remembered. That's the best memorial any of us could hope for. To be remembered not for how we died, but for how we lived, for the small kindnesses we showed, for the beauty we created, for the people we loved and who loved us in return. David Brennan lived that way. And 32 years after his death, when justice finally came, it arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of a job completed, of something broken, finally restored.